Thank you so much for coming tonight. Welcome to the Tech Talk series. I'm Chelsea with Google. We're so happy to have all of you here. Here's the brief agenda that we have for tonight. We're really excited to have our speakers and welcome them. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our technical manager on the test team, Ivan. He'll be starting our talk. So thanks again.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ivan Ho, and thank you for attending the event. See a lot of new faces, obviously. There's about 250 attendees and a lot of people who couldn't make it either, so that's great. Hopefully we have a couple of great presentations for you today. I will talk to you a little bit more about what I do at Google and in general what the test engineering culture is at Google. So this meetup actually started back in 2010, and it's been a resounding success with a number of events per year. Today's focus is around how we do things on iOS and just a little bit about the test engineering culture at Google, which I'll spend a few minutes on. For those who are new here to the Google New York City office, we're quickly growing and expanding since I joined. And just to give you an idea, this is the second largest engineering office outside of Mountain View for Google. So there are a large number of projects that we work on here in this particular office. And you know, this building specifically, I don't know if everyone knows this, but Google does own this building. We do have a lot of employees here and also at Chelsea Market. There's a lot of interesting tidbits and facts that are on the slide about this particular facility. So let's talk about a little bit about the culture at Google in regards to test engineering. As you can imagine, there's a lot of challenges that has to do with test engineering. And it's not an easy task, and it certainly cannot be a manual task either. Otherwise, we would not be able to deliver the type of software we do at such a rapid pace and at such a scale, right? So there's obviously a lot of automation, a lot of innovation that comes with it, right? And just because I am in what's called the test engineering community, that doesn't mean we are fully responsible for quality. I think there's a stigma out there that a lot of tech organizations, a lot of businesses think about quality assurance or test engineering as, hey, it's the QA guys. It's their job to make sure that everything works and nothing breaks and there are no bugs in it, right? Not true at Google, right? It's a collective effort. From the folks who write the software to the folks who actually deploy the software, it's a collective effort to make sure that we have a smooth process for delivering software out to production. Okay, everything we do, we have to make sure we scale, right? In order to do that, you know, we can't do that with just human beings alone, but we also have to do that with a lot of innovation and automation. And so we certainly have to make sure we spend our time wisely, right? You know, how do we, you know, do we spend our time, you know, making sure every single issue, every single use case has been tackled? You know, we have to balance quality and velocity, right? We want to make sure all users get the features that they need and making sure that all the critical issues have been taken care of immediately, right? So, you know, there's a good prioritization process on a per product basis to figure that out. As far as, you know, I'll just say it from a generic standpoint, you know, the test engineering roles that we have at Google, which I'll talk more about later, we're very much ingrained in every aspect of the software development lifecycle, right? From the design aspect to the implementation and the deployment aspect. So it's not very tail end, right? Where, hey, here's a build, here's a binary, go deploy, go try this out, tell me what breaks, log a few tickets, and then let me fix the bugs, and then go retry again. That's not how it works here. It's a very iterative process here, but it's also a very embedded process too. Okay. And we always strive for optimization, right? So if we know that there's a lot of things that are very repetitive, there should be no need to repeat that. Automate that as best as you can on every single platform, every single language possibly that the product supports. And you can imagine, you know, with the Google, with a company of our size and with the number of products that we have, that's a lot of languages, that's a lot of platforms, that's a lot of browsers. So you can imagine that there's a lot of optimization that we do here. So I will talk about two roles that we have in our test engineering discipline. One is called software engineering test. You may not have heard about this term outside of Google, and for those who have, that's great. I'm glad you did. But we are software engineers, right? Software engineers in test are folks who are passionate about serving our development community within the company. So as a software engineer test, my customers are developers. I make sure they have the right tools, the right code, build code, release code, and test code, right? Not so much as the end user focus, which is what a test engineer is responsible for. So I need to make sure that I have the right automation frameworks, the right debugging tools, the right monitoring tools, the right level automation that developer can feel very confident that when they check code in, things are not going to break. Okay. I want to make sure that the product that I work with is specifically AdWords, right? So with a product like that, with millions of users using AdWords, we want to make sure that our developers are confident that they can ship the software with a very consistent process in a very regular fashion. The key thing for us is that we listen to our developers. We understand their pain points. We want to make sure that if they are stumped by, let's say, for example, if they have to figure out how to put this new feature in but scale it at 2 million users, how can we help do that? If they don't know how to figure that out, we will help them figure that out. Okay. And I talked a lot about automation already, but for AdWords, hopefully a lot of people here are familiar with it or have used it. And the large majority of AdWords customers are using the web front end. That's what I focus on. So there's obviously a lot of cross-browser, cross-locale related testing associated with that. And how do we automate all that process too, right? So we don't have human beings that do all that work. There's just we can't ship software fast enough that way. These are some of the key buzzwords, the key skill sets that we look for when we talk about software engineers in test, right? They have to have the passion, right? The passion to write code, whether it's in Java, C++, Python, those are some of the core languages that we have. They're focused primarily on making sure that developers are efficient and that release engineers are efficient and test engineers are efficient at what they do. Okay, we do a lot of innovation generally because if you think of yourself as a software developer, for those that are engineers out there, you're writing the feature. You know that feature very well, but you may not know how it integrates with the other parts of the application or a third-party system. Well, the folks in the test community have a much broader or wider breadth of experience in that. So our role is to help them understand how those things work and how to make those scale and how to automate all that. And certainly, if we find a need to help them automate certain things, that's where we step in. We figure out what needs to be done. Nothing, it's very rare that developers say, hey, go do this or go do that. We have to come up with the ideas or say, we think it's a great idea if you do it this way. Here's the best practice for applying a set of unit tests or best practice for an integration test or having a continuous build and test environment, right? So these are all kind of things that we try to evangelize within the development community, okay? We do, from where I've come from in prior jobs and prior organizations, it's always been that waterfall model, right? You write code, have a binary, next phase, QA for 2 weeks or 2 months, whatever the product is, and it's not a very iterative process. And so, we definitely streamline all that here with most of the products. So let's talk about the other role, right? So now talk about the quality, the user side, the domain, right? So these are the people that the test engineers are the individuals and engineers too that also read code, that also write code, and they're responsible for understanding how a customer is going to use this product, right? And that's what majority of the test engineers do, at Google, and they work on the functional aspect, making sure that all the use cases that we can think of are properly validated, implementing the correct automation to support that. So they apply a lot of the things that the SETs built to make sure that the test automation is carried out. Okay. And they're also software engineers too, right? So they need to write code, they need to understand code as well. So while there are some repetitive manual process involved in some cases, if they find that to be the case, automate it away. Okay. Another key aspect that test engineers bring to the table is the planning and strategy, right? So they understand that this is how a customer is going to use this product. Here's how it's going to impact them when a new feature comes out. And so they figure out, they help the engineers figure out, hey, have you considered this scenario when you write this new feature? You added this new widget on the screen. Okay, what happens to all these other widgets? What happens if you disable this? Should these other fields be grayed out? These are the kind of things that, that are part of the process that test engineers get involved. And, some aspects of what a test engineer core competency is, a lot of planning. They are, very data driven. They focus a lot on product quality, obviously. They take the best in breed of test tools and best practices and apply to the product that they're responsible for. Okay? Just to give you an idea, these are some core products that we have at Google where we have dedicated engineers, SETs, and TEs that are working on all of these types of products, and then some. There's a lot more beyond this. And obviously, there's a lot of presence here within Google New York, where we have these two roles that we're always looking for good engineers to help fill those roles and work on these fantastic products, right? And then the disciplines that they focus on, they vary on the right-hand side, from release automation to developers tools to debugging, troubleshooting tools to security testing. All those are very important, and obviously for certain products, some are more important than others. Some are doing a lot more work on mobile. Some are doing a lot more work on back end. Some are doing more work on front end, like web applications. So a variety of technical skill sets involved. And frankly, it's a very different challenge if you think about what Google does, right? We not only have to worry about a product, but the number of users that we're potentially touching, the number of languages that we're shipping the software in, and the scale that we do things at. So it's a very unique challenge within Google for any engineer, whether you're a software developer, whether you're an SET, or whether you're a TE. So that's what makes my job fun here at Google. Okay. So what I'd like to do is introduce the next speaker. She's been a longtime Googler for 8 years, starting in the Google New York City office. She's worked on a number of products, Google Health, Local, Google Docs, Drive, and most recently Chrome Mobile. So I want to introduce Lindsay to come up and speak.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Pasricha, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about Chrome for iOS, our release process, our development process, and everything in between. I'll tell you just a little bit more about myself. I've been here since 2006, and Ivan's right, like I've worked on quite a few products. It's interesting here at Google, you can be here for 8 years and feel like you've not spent that 8 years on the same product. You can switch products. You're never forced to switch products or anything. It was by my choice, but we also have 20% time. So that's actually how I ended up on Chrome. I was doing 20% time when I was on the Docs team for Chrome, and it kind of turned into something a little bit like, well, maybe I should work on that product for a little while. So I ended up switching teams that way. But yeah, so Chrome for iOS. Can I ask how many of you are iPhone users? Oh, wow, cool. How many of you are iPhone developers? Okay, still very cool. I like it. I like it. Well, iPhone and iOS development at Google is definitely different, because most people, when they think mobile and they think Google, they think Android. And so a lot of times here at the company, they'll say mobile this or mobile that. They'll talk about mobile development, and they'll completely leave out that we have iOS products. They'll not mention Gmail or Maps or Chrome. So for us, we're really the underdogs here. We're really blazing our own path and trying to do things right by the user within an ecosystem that we do not own, and we are subject to the same rules that an individual developer is as a large corporation. So in this talk, I'll kind of go over that mobile space and some of the challenges there. I'll also tell you a little bit about how we develop our product, our dev channels and development flow, and our testing solutions that we have set up. So mobile development. As I mentioned before, Android is the big one that people think of when they think of Google mobile development. When we're working on iOS products at Google, it's kind of like sometimes I'll be using my iPhone in the cafeteria, and somebody will walk up and go, "What is this? Why do you have an iPhone?" And I'll be like, "Well, for what it's worth, colleague, we have iOS products, and we support them, and we want people to have a great experience on them, and we don't want to just leave that whole ecosystem unrepresented by Google. So we want to have a presence there." And then they're like, "Oh, okay, okay." But you'll see it sometimes even on mailing aliases internally. They'll be like, "Who has an iPhone here? What?" And it's just very interesting. We want to have a good experience and presence on both ecosystems. It's great that Android's done so well and that we own that ecosystem, and we can be the primary, from a Chrome perspective, be the primary browser for that for that whole mobile solution is like a dream come true. But still, many users are iOS users. Many users will stay iOS users, and we want to serve their needs on that platform as well. So those are our two biggest ecosystems. I will acknowledge I didn't put Windows mobile phone here. And for anybody who that offends, I apologize. I just don't have a lot to say there. So development environments. So for those of you that are familiar with iOS development, you're probably aware of Xcode being a very major option for your iOS development needs. We use Xcode with a combination of some internal solutions as well. Not everything's like super proprietary and secret though. Like we're using GYP, GIP files, to manage our dependencies, just like a lot of other projects are. We use Git, which is our source management system. It's have any of you used Git before? Any of you Git developers? How many of you are like SVN? No, it's a hard transition to make. I will tell you that much. I was using traditional SVN solutions here at Google with our internal products. We weren't using Git yet, and then when I moved to iOS, we were using Git, and it's a whole different world. My favorite thing is that there's no centralized repository really, and change lists or CLs, as a traditionally defined, don't really exist in a Git world. It's just your hash, whatever hash your change is assigned. That's your identifier, and it's been quite a learning process for me. But we develop on Git. We develop our milestones. So you might notice sometimes that Chrome needs to update. It'll be our release number 27 or 30 or 32. These are called our milestones. We'll use Git to develop on our 36 branch, for example. And we use a lot of automated build solutions to make this go as fast as possible. So we use bots, which are devices, physical devices, that we'll have set up in a room, and we have a lab, and somebody will manage those devices. If they totally just become borked, we have to have somebody go and restart them. It's a real joy. It's a real joy. But one of the great things about iOS development is, up until now, it's been a very limited number of devices that we have to support. Limited screen resolutions. Your iPhone 5 is your iPhone 5. That's your screen resolution. You don't have to worry too much about variances there. Same for iPad. You have your iPad Retina, you have your iPad without Retina, and you have your iPad Mini with and without Retina. So our matrix is not explosive, whereas my counterparts on Chrome for Android are in the pits of hell because they have to support so many device configurations, and they all are launching somewhat with Google's oversight and without at the same time. So you can imagine how sometimes they find out about a device that's coming out and they're like as surprised as you are, and they have to quickly make sure that they're correctly supporting the resolution and the firmware specifications on that device. And of course, some of these hardware providers are making their own tweaks to Android, which can also end up being catastrophic for some of our apps, which assume some parts of our bootstrapping won't be changed. So good for them. But it will change with this iPhone 6 that we're all reading about in the news. I don't know anything you don't know, but this larger screen that we're seeing leaked images of and stuff like that, maybe my device support matrix will explode. We'll see. So the interesting thing about what we're trying to do on iOS specifically is we're trying to bring that Chrome experience that mostly everybody, enjoys on their desktop to a device where there are a lot of restrictions. and how you can operate, and there are a lot of restrictions on what APIs you can use and what services you can provide to a user. So having our browser on Mac OS X is a very completely different experience than having our browser on iOS. On iOS, Apple is exposing to us the UI web view, and that's all you get. And for those of you who know about UI web view, you know it's a black box. You don't get to ask for more than what is given to you in terms of the public APIs, and they're quite limited. And they're buggy, which is also cool. And so this is, we're working with those limitations against a browser that is the native browser for that ecosystem, which is Safari, which has access to all those private APIs that we totally love to have, and makes very good use of those private APIs that we can't use. So we're a bit at a disadvantage, and Apple is not in a rush to enable a user to change their default browser. So you know, like, we have to kind of work around that and earn our users, and our users have to go out of their way to open their content in our browser, and we appreciate that, and we want to make sure that they have a good experience when they, you know, do this rigmarole to open their link in our browser instead of in Safari, because it can be quite challenging. So yeah, native browser versus secondary browser, it's just we're really the underdog. We're really trying to earn the users' trust and desire to come back to us. And there's some really cool things we're doing to try to make that as appealing as possible. So for you iPhone users, have any of you noticed that we introduced this single sign-on experience? Yeah? By show of hands? Oh, good. Wow. Well, I'm glad you guys noticed. So one of the things we introduced in the past few milestones was, well, I guess it's not that recent, but it was last fall, was the ability to, if you log into your Gmail account, which many of you do because you can't really do much with your Gmail app without logging in. So if you log into your Gmail app, then you have the option, without having to type in your password all over again, to log into Chrome. And what this does is it makes all of those tabs that you had on your desktop available to you on your iOS device, and vice versa. And this way you have sync tabs, you have all of your autofill forms, lots of good we know you experiences in that way. This was a huge deal to Apple, and of course they weren't like the biggest fan of us creating an authentication layer, but many other companies are now doing this. We're seeing this with Facebook. In a lot of places. We're also seeing this for smaller development companies and game developers, where they have multiple games and they want you to save your data, and they want you to have your data, the level you were at, saved from your iPad to your iPhone, and other experiences like that. So it's a valuable feature that Apple initially didn't want to enable because they wanted to. They didn't want there to be security risks, which nobody does. We don't want to introduce that either. But it just made managing our authentication keychain so much easier and so much more secure, actually, when you don't have users thinking they have to type in their password all the time. Things become a lot more secure because they're not just on PayPal.UK.CSV or whatever URL, not checking which provider they're on, typing their PayPal password. It's better when we're managing that keychain. We know that they authenticated already, and we're offering that profile to that user without having to authenticate again. So they weren't with it at first, but we got it approved, and ever since then we've never looked back. This has been a really big improvement, a nice experience for our users. Another thing that we have to deal with as being just another guy, just another Joe Schmo in the App Store, is we have to have our releases signed and reviewed by Apple the same way everyone else does. It's not a simple process. I'll go over it a little bit more later. And we have to, for many of you who aren't doing iOS development, it might be surprising to find out that you can't just test your app on iOS. You can't just install it and willy-nilly start playing with it on the device. You have to have a developer account. Then you have to assign to that developer account your device and its exact ID, and then they'll approve that, and then you can start installing your dev sign builds, but you only get 100 devices to do that with. And so for a Google, right, that could be a little limiting, right? Like 100 devices I could use in our automated test setup for Chrome, to be specific. So Maps would get no testing, Gmail would get no testing. This is really limiting. We've had to really work with Apple to say, listen, we need more leeway. And they've given us a lot more than the 100, which is helpful, but it's still very constricting, and we have to be very precise with how we use our resources on the iOS development side. And then the other thing to mention, so you might have noticed how on the App Store you can't get beta versions of applications. This is very different for Chrome as a product, where we live by, giving our users canary builds, giving our users beta builds, and getting that early feedback. It's part of how we manage our test solution. So not having any of this in Chrome for iOS really makes us like the ugly duckling in the Chrome group. Like, they always assume that we have, they as in Chrome desktop, always assume that we have users that are external using our beta and canary. They're constantly shocked to find out that that's strictly not allowed on iOS. So it's a bit of a struggle for us, but we found a lot of ways to work around it, which I'll go over in the presentation. All right, so our release and dev process for Chrome for iOS. We do run internal-only dev, canary, and beta builds. So this means that other Googlers can download and install our pre-stable versions, which doesn't end up being as many users as you might think. We still don't have anything like what desktop has, and the millions of beta users and millions of canary users. We have a very piddly, like, couple hundred beta users or something like that, because many Googlers don't have iOS devices. So we can't take advantage of our tens of thousands of colleagues using our products because they all usually have Androids. So just to kind of give you an idea of like when we're planning our app development, we have a 6 to 9 week release process that begins with getting feature approvals for a milestone. We do this across all of Chrome. So this is for desktop, this is for Android, this is for iOS. These all get approved by our stakeholders. So our VP of engineering goes over each of our features and will either okay it for that milestone, or we'll say, no, you guys, you're looking a little amateur here. You need to go back to the drawing board. And we've had both happen to us. When I first joined Chrome on iOS, which was about almost 2 years ago now, they were getting sent home from our VP of engineering without their features approved very often, because they were going in unprepared. Their feature had not been enabled yet on Dev or Canary, which means that even their teammates weren't using that feature yet, which you should probably be doing 6 to 9 weeks before you're going to an App Store release with millions of users. So it wasn't surprising that they were having a rough time. So I had to kind of help them with preparing for that. And a lot of it came down to being at the place of feature development where you still have polish and bugs to fix, but you're not doing heavy development on the branch. Nobody likes to do heavy development on the branch. You have to get merge approved every single CL. It's really slow. You'd rather just be able to check in your changes into the code repository and see them instantly. So everybody wants to develop on trunk, so that's what we kind of move towards, is pushing back that development cycle and saying, if you're not developing on trunk, you're not going to have a good time anyway, so why don't we all just do ourselves a favor and get that development done earlier, and if your feature's not ready, you should wait. This was really hard for our product managers to hear. Our product managers were not happy with this change, but they're a lot happier now that they can count on a release all the time. We don't miss releases anymore. One dirty little phase of iOS, Chrome for iOS's history, is that we used to only release odd-numbered builds because we were so often behind on our development process that we'd never get to start working on the features or any of the changes for an even-numbered release, and we'd skip it. So when I joined, we had released 19, 21, 23, and 25. Those were our releases, and I was like, you guys have a good thing going, and I'm happy for you, but I think we'd like to just be like the rest of Chrome and actually release an even-numbered milestone, too. So we have since matured in this way, and we release all of our even and odd numbers. But there's plenty of fire drills and disasters, so I can tell you about those as we go further. So that's about 6 weeks of polish, bug fixes on the branch. This is where we're doing a lot of our testing for our next milestone that will get up for review by Apple. During this process, it's regression testing. We're really going into the details of new feature testing and looking at any of our automated systems, which I'll kind of go over in detail in the next couple slides. We're going over the results of those automated tests as well as manual solutions. Because for those of you who do, or even if you work on Android, mobile development in general is not known for its awesome automated testing frameworks that are available. Desktop is in a much better space. So yes, we'll usually submit after about 6 weeks of development on the branch. We'll submit for Apple's approval. And this can be an interesting process. Something that we've had in our app since we launched can be emailed to us as Apple, and Apple won't email you the details of why they don't approve you. You get an email that says, we should talk. We should talk. When call me when you get in. And they leave a phone number. So you never really get like a written overview of like what they reviewed. It's a very black box process. You're just kind of wondering if they've started review. And they said, don't even talk to us if your app hasn't been under review for 2 weeks. Don't ask us what the status is. Don't ping us for like, are you almost done? Like none of that. They're like, don't even speak. We'll contact you. We'll let you know. So we wait, like good little app developers, for 2 weeks, usually. And sometimes it will be a question about something that we've had in the app from the beginning of time, and it'll just be a matter of confusion by the reviewer. And we'll be like, listen, this has been here the whole time. Why would this be a blocker for us releasing a Chrome for iOS version now? And they'll be like, oh, yeah, my bad. They'll be like, approved. Or they'll be like, let's talk to your VP. So then we might have to have our VP talk to somebody else at Apple. But since I've joined, we've never had a milestone completely blocked. It's usually just a misunderstanding, and we're able to clear that up and get it on out to the public. The fun part about getting it out to the public is because we go from that piddly number of internal users at Google to millions of users in the public, sometimes we find out that stuff doesn't work like we expected. There's so many websites that do so many creative things with JavaScript, with HTML. We can't possibly cover it all, even with the best automated solutions. So many times we will find out that something is not loading the way that was expected, and we need to do a quick fire drill respin of this build. And those will be, you'll see them in the App Store. It'll be like, here's your newest release of 36.0.2062.1, right? And then 2 days later you'll see Chrome has an update. That is when we've had a fire drill and we've been freaking out and trying to get something fixed for the public very quickly. Apple doesn't usually take 2 weeks with those. thank God, we can put a note when we resubmit that this is for a bug that went out with our last release. And usually they're pretty kind and give us less than a week of review time. But these are fun. Respins are something that I'd like to say we don't do. I'd like to say we're so secure and mature in our development process that we don't need them, but we do, and it happens. So a bit about our automated testing. So our bots are our salvation. These automated solutions are absolutely the biggest thing that helps us get that early feedback on our code quality. So a lot of these builds, it doesn't look really fancy. You can see from the screenshot, it's just green and red blocks, and either you passed or you didn't. Like, that's really it. But we'll have, like, our group of test cases, and one of them might fail. We have end-to-end tests. We have unit tests. And we have them running on each one of our channels. So on the dev channel, we'll have it as a pre-submit check. On the Canary, it will be the merge set of all the changes that are going into trunk. And we'll have our automated tests, unit tests, and end-to-end tests running there. And then we'll also have more end-to-end tests that are running also on the beta channel, which is our closer to Appstore release. But these are just a godsend, and we're lucky enough as the Chrome product area that we have a whole group called the infrastructure team, and they manage our devices. So those devices that I was telling you somebody will walk up to physically and restart it when it gets borked. We have a whole team of people that will take care of that for us in Mountain View, and it's such a luxury. When I was on Docs, they didn't have that. So I don't know, 2 years ago I helped launch Drive on iOS, and it was such a stressful thing because we had no bots. They have no infrastructure team on the Docs team, and they're still working on that, by the way. And when you only rely on manual testing, your cycles can be limited by how fast your manual testers can return this. And really, your developers want their feedback earlier than what your manual testers can give as feedback. Our developers want to know at pre-submit check that an important test failed, because that's why that's during the time that they're in context for that change list. They don't want to have to go back a week and a half later after the manual testers finally got to that test case and make that change. So I can't recommend enough finding a framework that will work, and I'll talk to you a bit about the frameworks that we found. So we have the traditional unit tests, which are also, I'm sorry, is there like a hand up, or I wasn't sure. Oh, okay, sorry. Don't mind the hand. All right, so we have our traditional unit tests, which are great. You want those lower level tests to be checking your expected variable values at various states of your code passing. So we keep those, we add to those, we live by those. In addition to that, we have end-to-end tests with the KIF framework, which is based off IOTA. This we found to be a little bit more reliable, less flaky than UIA. For those of you who have done any automated testing, you're familiar with whether it's desktop or whether it's mobile. Your end-to-end test frameworks are sometimes at the mercy of your load times of your web pages, and when text fields and objects in the DOM become visible to your operator, which is the test framework. So we have those problems too in KIF, the same as we would on desktop. But we found that with KIF, we can rely on the accessibility label. So even on desktop, accessibility labels are hugely important. You should be doing them anyway, right? This is something where you want to be inclusive to everyone, visually impaired. You want to make sure that every element in your app is accessible. So the added bonus is if you make your test framework dependent on those, you'll automatically be addressing the needs of those who are visually impaired and need those labels on those UI elements. So it's a great thing to depend on for your end-to-end test cases. And these for us will write for every new feature, we'll write end-to-end tests that are simply test cases, test scenarios. A user opens Chrome, logs in, navigates to a website, it loads, we verify some text on it, and then we'll close it. That's a very simple scenario, but that's an example of one that would be an end-to-end KIF test. One of the funny things I discovered was that I wanted to navigate to google.com on one of my test scenarios, which is like, you know, pretty assumable here. And so I'm like navigating happily to google.com, and I'm expecting that, of course, google.com will have accessibility labels on their search field, right? Totes. No. They have no accessibility labels on almost anything on that page. And I was shocked, because usually we're not even allowed to launch stuff like that. But, you know, GWIS is special. GWIS is what we call Google Web Search. They're special, and they are the reason our company is, aside from ads, so they get away with some stuff that even they shouldn't. So they have a pending bug. We'll see when it gets fixed. I'm sure my baby will be born before then. Might be graduating from college. So yes, aside from the end-to-end tests, we have performance tests, which these are just a set of URLs that we're just running through and comparing the performance per run in the same milestone. You don't want to compare different milestones because the changes per milestone might affect your run, but you just want to watch incrementally over the release cycle of your current milestone that those numbers don't go up. Those have been very good for us. They've also helped reduce some of those fire drills that I mentioned where there's some random URL that doesn't load. These have been very helpful. And the screenshot tests below, same thing, list of URLs, taking a screenshot, and we can have we can set our screenshotter to say if there's this X% of change in how this URL displays, we can have a manual tester review it. This is good and bad. I love the idea, but a lot of home pages change by 80%, between runs, and it's all content change and ads change. So we get a lot of false positives with this, but it's still faster than trying to go through all the URLs manually. So we kind of wait it out, and we still take it. So manual testing, we do still have it. We don't want to, but we do still have it. And any mobile developer and mobile product developer usually has manual testing, even if it's just the developer himself running through his app and checking it manually. You can't escape it. We just don't have the solutions, especially on the iOS space. So what are we doing for manual testing? Sometimes there's test cases that can't be automated. I'm trying to think of a couple of good examples for iOS specifically. There are some user types that are rate limited, that we can't run through some of our scenarios as fast. There are special account types that have monitoring on them. These are usually enterprise accounts that are owned by admins. So if you've ever heard of Google Apps for Schools, for example, some admins put restrictions on actions for some of their faculty members, for example. And so this would be an example where we couldn't do an automated test because it would run through too fast. What else do we have? The other thing that we like to do with our manual testing is, for those of you who have worked with automated testing, whether it be desktop or mobile, sometimes those test cases get marked as flaky because, again, sometimes your text field shows up within those 5 milliseconds, and sometimes it shows up in 6 milliseconds, and your test will fail if it's only waiting for 5 milliseconds. And a lot of times the developers will mark a test as flaky without telling anyone. So that's why we still keep a manual check in a lot of our regression testing, just in case the test has been turned off. Nobody knew, but we want to make sure it's covered anyway. Test cases that haven't been automated yet. So for any of you who have launched a product ever, you'll know that when you're in launch mode, you collect technical debt. You accrue technical debt, so, to be more accurate. We have this as well. When we launched 19, milestone 19, which was our first release, they did not automate anything. They didn't automate typing in the Omnibox, which is like super basic. So we've made up some of that debt on the Chrome for iOS team, but certainly there's a lot of things that weren't covered. One of the biggest things that wasn't covered since our launch until about 4 weeks ago was our tab switcher, which is pretty important. No automated tests. Why would you do that? Apparently it wasn't important. And the other thing is new features. So a lot of times we're getting that approval from our executives, our engineering VP, when we're going up for a new feature. Your automated tests aren't written yet, and sometimes you might get through the whole milestone and not have them written until the end. It is part of our gating process for development of any new feature, but sometimes it doesn't happen until the very end. This is one of the biggest things that I could say we changed on the Chrome for iOS team since I joined, is requiring the ownership of quality to be on the software engineer's plate. That it is required for them to be able to say they launched a feature such as search by voice in Chrome, which was a big one. If he wants to have that accolade on his Google resume, he has to write the test for it, or else it doesn't launch. And this is something very hard to get agreement on from your stakeholders, your executives, your product managers. They don't like to not launch a feature because it doesn't have an automated test, but they really like it when they find out that it broke and we never released that version because it never made it past pre-submit, or it never made it into Canary because of our end-to-end tests. So this one was very difficult to get buy-in on, but I can't recommend it enough. So just to give you an idea for where we exert most of our effort for manual testing, we don't do it early on in the process. We really rely on those bots that I was talking about earlier, those continuous builds, and having those be the early signal on quality for the developers. So on the dev channel, there's no manual testing. On Canary, we'll do comparison testing and CL delta testing. CL delta testing is somewhat like shocking to people, but for anybody who's done manual tests, you'll know that if you want to make a heat map or a matrix of where your risk is, it's going to be in the change, which sounds really obvious, but people forget that all the time. They just make test sets and they go, we're just going to do all these regression test cases, and that's where we're going to live at, and we're going to be great. But you can lessen so much of your load to manual tests, and you can also really bring up your confidence about your release candidates if you're going through the actual changes that are in that release candidate. One of the biggest things that some teams fight tooth and nail is giving release notes to their test team or to anybody that's their counterpart about what they've changed. They fight release notes to users, right? But if you're tracking what you've changed, you can test around those changes really tightly and feel very confident about the quality of what you're about to send out to people. Quite sad. Sad story. So on the beta, by the time our product is reaching our beta, and we're in that 6-week stage where we're just doing those bug fixes and polishes before we send to Apple, this is where we're doing that regression test case set, where we're doing some traditional test cases that are outside of our CL Delta, and we're also polishing up our testing for our new features. And whatever new changes are getting merged in, those bug fixes, we're checking the change list for those as well. And then for stable, so once we send out that update to you guys in the App Store, we're just downloading the same app that you guys are and running through, okay, if I'm updating from milestone 27 to milestone 37, because milestone 27 we use client login, and then milestone 37 we started to use that shared login solution that I was talking about earlier. This is where we'll do an upgrade test on production to be able to test that with production signing, because again, Apple will sign your releases. So that's not a test case we can do at the dev stage because it's not stable signed by Apple. And we'll also just quickly run through our new features and make sure they're working well in production. Sometimes people forget to on their development servers for a new feature, they'll have it, checking that your user agent is Chrome for iOS and that you're a dev build. And they forget on the day of launch to include the stable flag. So that's pretty cool. One of the big things coming up with iOS 8 is test flight. And I was super excited about this when they mentioned it at WWDC. They were like, we're going to open up a beta user population for our iOS developers and give them that relief they've been looking for. And so, like, I'm, in a conference room freaking out during the during the keynote for this because I'm like, yay! So what this is you can use test flight. So this will only be available once iOS goes Gold Master, which is what they call when it goes public. You'll be able to offer your beta product to 100 users. So again, that 100 limitation. But it's not per company. It is per product, which was relieving to find out. And the only other downside to this is that you can't have stable and beta coexist on the same device. So if you do invite a user to your beta program, they can't run your stable app from the App Store. So it's kind of disappointing. But other than that, I'm very excited about this. I'm looking forward to the iOS 8 launch. We're definitely, one other point is, since I can't have coexisting builds, I'm not going to bother giving our users a canary build because if it crashes, I don't know if any of you use, can anybody raise their hand if you use the canary distribution of Chrome? Some days it's painful, right? Some days you have to IM each other and be like, don't update, don't restart, because you can't type in any text field randomly one day. So this one, I'm not going to bother with planning canary builds for iOS. It will probably just be beta, where that way it's a little bit of a higher bar of quality, and we can make sure that users won't be IMing each other not to update. So just to give you an idea of like other types of testing that we're doing, of course we're going through accessibility testing and internationalization testing. These are very important to us. We don't do full sweeps per milestone. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of using VoiceOver in iOS, but it can be quite slow and also very janky. So we do that, we'll do full sweeps about twice a year across the product. And then outside of that, we do the same thing that I was mentioning before, focusing on your change. New features, areas that have had change in code, we'll do accessibility runs on those. And that helps us kind of manage the gap in between those full test sweeps. Same thing for internationalization. The upgrade testing I mentioned earlier is mainly about making sure that any user that updates from release sign builds that are earlier in the milestone flow to our current one, nothing is broken for them. Sync, sign on, all of that good stuff. Security testing, we go through security review with every single feature at Google, and there's an entire security team assigned to that. So for our major features, those will have the entire team's review. For smaller features, they'll just have a single security engineer's review. Geolocation testing, also very important. Some of our best bugs have been versions of websites that are only served to certain geolocales. So we can't repro it. And even if the site doesn't serve a different version according to your geolocation, sometimes us as a company, we have different versions of Google Web Search, for example, that are being pushed to data centers across a 24-hour period. So one of our fire drills was that GWS had pushed a change to their mobile view and how they served our Omnibox searches. And I couldn't repro it. Nobody in the US could, but everybody in India could. And that's because their data center had been refreshed. None of our data centers in the US had been refreshed yet. And we didn't know that GWS had pushed a new build. So we were just like, why do you see it? Why don't I? And so we spent 24 hours panicking. And then finally, the data center that I was hitting got the upgrade. And I was like, oh, that's what's happening. So Those are always fun. And then user type testing, which I mentioned earlier, enterprise users versus consumers. So this is my overview. I just yelled at you guys about iOS development for the past 30 minutes. Do we have any questions? And you can also ask questions about Ivan's presentation earlier about the products and test roles as well. We'll start with the microphone. So if you have questions, just head up to the microphone.
Bob Gazelter, you noted a problem with testing on images because of different web server responses. Why? Any particular reason why you haven't just written the necessary code to log what comes back to each of the URLs and stick it on your own server so you can do run to run?
We've done those, and we have those. What he's talking about?
It seems to cure the problem.
Yes, so there's two different issues, though. This is great. So saving the HTML of a certain page and just making sure that the rendering happens exactly the same between two builds is definitely something we set up and we use. But then what happens is those sites implement a new view, and that will break. And so then those tests don't help us in that space. So we have both.
I was just looking for not being able to reproduce the test you did on the previous rev.
Yeah, it helps a lot. And also it helps for, like, sometimes they'll have ads that won't serve. These type of things, we definitely think that, downloading a copy of the HTML, the DOM of that site, and then comparing it between milestones is
responses. Stick a rev number in them, please.
Rev numbers. Fair enough.
Hi, thanks for your tech talk. I was asking, can you go into more about the bots that you use? We've used continuous integration with the Xcode bots, but then in the past I've dealt with Jenkins and some other things, but can you give us more detail on what you do?
Sure. What we have set up is there's a continuous build system called Pulse that we use within Google. And you don't use that to run your end-to-end tests. You use that just to create your build and to sign it properly so that you can run your iOS instrumentation on top of that. In order to run iOS instrumentation, you always have to have it dev signed correctly. So Pulse will handle the building and the signing. And then we have what we call the waterfall. And you can actually find this just on chromium.org. They have the waterfall for desktop. We have the same thing for iOS, and usually the same version numbers, so nothing's too surprising there. But we have these different bots that are running our tests. So for desktop, they're using different solutions. They're using, like, Selenium, for example, to run their end-to-end tests. Just for us, what we have set up is some of them are Mac OS X boxes with simulators open. But the problem with those is that they always end up with a lot more memory than the actual real devices have. And so we miss memory issues on those. So we only use those for certain things. And then otherwise, they're running on actual devices. We're using our development instrumentation and the KIF tests to do those end-to-end tests and serving those results up. And this is our waterfall. We're able to reuse what's from Chromium. It's simply just a web solution for collecting results of a test run and showing the passes. So you name your test run unit tests for sign-in, unit tests for Omnibox. And each of these will show up in the waterfall as green or red if they all passed. And then the same thing for our KIF tests. We'll label it KIF test for first run experience. And that will show up if all tests pass, they'll show up as green. Is there something else you're looking for?
Good.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks so much for hosting this awesome event. I was actually wondering about something you sort of talked about a little bit earlier on, which is that people at Google can test. So I was wondering how much you and the Googlers that you work with choose to specialize in certain products versus being more generalist and testing lots of different things.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Sandy and I, we work in the ads and commerce group. So and within ads and commerce, there's a lot of products that we cover. Not just AdWords, but there's a lot on the display side. There's stuff on the AdSense side. There's Google Wallet. There's payment. There's all sorts of things, right? But our roles are in general, as far as Google engineer is concerned, there's a lot of flexibility and movement from project to project. From one technology area to another technology area. So like if I wanted to do some work on from desktop to mobile, and that's a whole nother group, that's an opportunity that is available, right? So so we're not tied to a particular product necessarily, nor are we tied to a particular specialty. Same.
I think so. There's two different aspects to this. Like you as a test engineer or as a software engineer in test are not tied to a specific product. You can go work on whatever product. On the other hand, we find that as a whole, the discipline works better when we are tightly coupled to a specific product. For example, you work with AdWords, right? So like your team is very familiar with AdWords and can speak to their needs better than I could. I work on publisher platform, and I can speak to their needs better than Ivan could. And I think that's one of the key differences. Like we don't have a Google-wide team that does test infrastructure. We have specific teams for specific products.
And one other thing that makes our jobs even more interesting, even though we're in two different groups working on two different products, we share common experiences. So if we're working on desktop-oriented products, web-related testing, or even a similar ad serving platform, we share the same, we more than likely have common problems that we like to collectively solve together. There's no internal competition whatsoever. It's just a matter of, hey, what's the best practice? Have someone done this with mobile, or have someone done this? So like, for example, like when ads are rendered on your web browser, how do we know those are correct? Well, how many ad products we have that does this thing, right? So everyone has the same problem across different products, and we just trying to find a common way to solve this problem collectively as a group.
How do you communicate between those different products?
Well, yeah, so that's the good thing about having a community within Google. So in ads and commerce, we have several hundred of engineers around the world that have these regular discussions around top challenges, or even just sharing ideas of innovations and accomplishments is a way to get the word out. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
We also have testing grouplets where we exchange ideas and how we've done testing solutions. Grouplets are groups of people within Google that talk about certain things. So we have a testing grouplet. We have a Greyglers grouplet, which is Googlers over 50. We have Gayglers grouplet, which is the LGBT community within Google. So lots of grouplets. But there's a testing one where we'll do demonstrations of the solutions we put together for each of our products. Your specialized knowledge is definitely considered when you're applying at Google, in that if you work for an iOS product or you work on an iOS product, you have iOS experience, they'll be targeting iOS test managers who have headcount, who are ready to hire, that have iOS products that they're owning. But the reason why people kind of need to be generalists is because you don't know which test manager is actually going to bite for your resume. So you kind of have to be a well-rounded candidate. So that's why if you're like super specialized in only one type of specific thing, it's a little bit harder. But when you have that generalist knowledge, a lot of people will be interested in you.
So first, thank you both for fantastic talks. So you mentioned that Chrome for iOS shares a lot of the instrumentation that Chromium uses. So how much of what you do and work with is open source, and how much of it leverages Google's proprietary internal infrastructure?
A lot would be hellaciously generous. We don't share as much as Chrome on Android, for example. The reason why we can't is because of UI WebView, which I mentioned earlier. So basically, a lot of our rendering engine is completely irrelevant in the iOS space. Because basically we can only use the public APIs offered within UI WebView, soon to be UK WebView. So when I say that we reuse some of our parent or I call desktop legacy platforms. Some of our legacy platforms tools, I'm usually talking about some of our more common infrastructure, which is like those those bots, our waterfalls, and how we're handling our release process, going up as a common product with our VP and having the same evaluation of our features, stuff like that. But stuff that we share from upstream would be like sync, bookmarks, NetStack, some of our NetStack and security checks for fraudulent sites, autofill. It's not that much, especially when it comes to rendering. It's disappointing. I wish we could reuse more of it, but it's just because we have the UI WebView limitation.
And how much of the peripheral infrastructure, things that are maybe shipped with Chrome but are used in the build process, in the testing process? Oh, I'm sure a lot of iOS stuff is not translatable to Android.
Not. But the best example of like those peripheral services is that infrastructure team that will manage our bots.
Not open sourced.
Huh?
You can't open source the team.
Yeah. that's not open sourceable. But I don't know what the path to open source looks like for Chrome for iOS, especially because we can only reuse some things. I think that a lot of people in Chromium feel like they've open sourced the upstream and that might satisfy and be good enough. I don't think that we have any executive who's burning for us to make everything else open source when we're just using the UI WebView. But we have the same problem actually with Chrome on Android, where the reason why they haven't done any, like they've started their open sourcing, but they're also running into the same thing. Well, this is open source upstream. What are the compelling arguments for doing the open source work on a smaller platform? For me, I think that open sourcing legacy is not as important. Legacy platforms is not as important as opening up mobile platforms. But there's actually a lot of controversy around that internally. Like some people feel very differently about that.
Thank you.
That was helpful.
Thank you very much for doing these talks. They're really, really helpful. Just first a comment. Whenever I see an iOS developer, I ask them if they have set their triple tap on their home button to accessibility for VoiceOver, just to see if they're actually testing, because that's the easiest way to do it. So the question
Interesting point. The only thing, you can do a lot more for accessibility testing more than VoiceOver. You can do contrast testing, you can do magnified text testing, and you'll be surprised at some of the things that this breaks.
The question I have, though, happens to be around not just different devices, which you did talk about, but different iOS versions. So when iOS 8 comes out, we're going to have extensions, we're going to have all these things that aren't compatible, backwards compatible, and we have a lot of legacy devices that only support iOS 6. So how can you explain how you're using testing to, I guess, develop and also release software that's going to be compatible with all your users?
Well, one thing that I think is important is for everybody to draw a baseline of what is your minimum number of users that you're willing to respin your milestone for. If that's 5% of users being broken, if that's 3% or 2% or 1%. We have drawn our line somewhere around 5%, which for the jailbroken example I said earlier, actually jailbroken users weren't that high of a percentage at that time, but we still did it just because those are a loud group of users. And they are the ones who will jailbreak their phone to make you their primary browser. So we had to get it together. But for iOS 5, for even iOS 6, if these platforms are not going to be more than an X% of your user distribution, then you really should think about how much you're investing in supporting them, because having device proliferation and configuration, like all of your different configuration permutations, adding for 3% of your users might not be as compelling. For us, I draw the line. I get to draw that line. So for iOS 8, when that comes out, I get to look at the numbers on, the following, usually it's about 2 weeks. You'll see your adoption in iOS happen. And if iOS 6 is not above that threshold for me, I'm going to say, A, you won't fix the bugs if I file them. So B, we won't support it.
But and Apple may be supporting legacy versions of Chrome in the future, I guess, if that's one solution to that. But then you can't also update that, and if there's any changes, and you're locked, especially if there's any server components.
Oh, yeah. No. We have left users on iOS 5 with a sync bug that I feel immensely guilty about. But it's done. And to them, I am sorry.
That's totally, I mean, if you're willing to accept that technical debt, that's fine. But what do you do, I guess, in testing? Is there any sort of automated testing that you check for deprecated method, or anything like that?
I mean, we do keep our bots for iOS 5, for example. We kept bots running for iOS 5 for, I think it was 6 months past my threshold for any support that would be like active manual testing support or our device configuration. So my compromise there was that we will support bots running on our Canary and Beta for iOS 5. But if the tests don't uncover those failures, then we're not going to be doing any additional test passes. Because I'll tell you what, the developers won't fix the bug anyway. Like, they don't want to fix the bug. It's not an interesting problem to them. And they're like, then it becomes an argument of me trying to say, oh, well, this affects 3% of users. And that's not a compelling argument. Yeah. Is that disappointing? You look really disappointed. It's true. No. It's legitimately a lot of users. But when you're doing that back support, it is at the cost of something in your future. And so you have to decide whether you'd rather support those old 500,000 users who refuse to upgrade and are behind in a lot of ways, right? So even Apple's encouraging them to, like, let it go. But, so then that would be at the cost of us using those new features, like you mentioned, extensions and sharing and stuff like that in iOS 8. And, yeah, and we'd rather do that. Yeah. Last question.
About estimation of testing, like as a percentage of a new feature, how much of a percentage of that time is allocated to testing, and is it a standard metric, or is it something where the amount changes depending on the complexity of the feature?
The percentage of time through that 6-week period, or like?
Generally, if you're estimating a feature and say the software engineer
like estimating how long it'll take to test.
Like, would you say, do you have a standard number that you just kind of slap on it for testing, or is it something where you work with the engineer to determine the test plan?
It certainly depends on the feature. One huge feature that really changed our lives was the shared login, and that's a feature, but that was like comprehensive, and I told them the 4 weeks of the first 4 weeks of our branch were testing, and don't ask me any questions about how it's going, and I'll call you type thing. So that one was a huge one. But smaller features, there's an example in 36. I think we had a new first run experience, and I was like, all I need for that is I look at our device configurations that we have to cover, the iOS versions that we have to cover, and just look at the test cases that we've written out for that, and I kind of estimate out that way, and usually I can get pretty close to the number of days we need.
Testing versus building, is it kind of half and half, 20% test, 80% test? So if a feature takes 100 hours to build, what would the time that you would kind of allocate in your head for testing be?
I don't know that I have a good enough view into how many hours they spent developing it to say that it would be 50% of the time or something like that.
Don't have any real conception of the time spent building it up.
I do and I don't. It depends on the feature, but like I would say it's not equal. It's a lesser amount of time to do the testing, and it's certainly an even lesser amount of time if the developer really understands what their feature impacts and can give us a bit of a footprint on what are the peripheral things we should check in terms of a risk heat map as well. Then if they can really reduce that, then your testing time can be 15 or 25% of what your development time was. But most developers don't take care to do that, and so we spend time like fucking crime scene investigators trying to figure out what their feature does in this case when they could have just told us.
And I just want to add a little bit more to that because in a different context, in the web application space, like AdWords, for example, the product's always running 24/7. Millions of users are using it. We're literally changing the tires on the car when it's driving 100 miles per hour, and that still happens. We don't slow down for 1 mile per hour at all. So for our perspective, that's why we have automation in place for a lot of that. So there could be dozens of developers putting in new features week after week, and maybe half of those features will go out the same week, or it could be the following week. So for us, we have a very consistent constraint in terms of how much time we have to test. So better for us, the onus is on the developers, and the onus is on the SETs and ETEs to make sure that there's proper automation in place, because we can't we have to release, and some products release on a very regular basis, like we're talking about within days.
It's about making sure that people do it up front and make
Absolutely.
sure that the quality
So
is
absolutely. So when you are involved in building projects like that at a global scale, at a scale that we do, or even close enough, you have to think along those lines from an engineering practice.
One of the things I didn't mention was it depends on how actively the developer is still changing that new feature throughout our testing process. If they're checking in a lot of changes still and we're in week 3 of our branch, then they've wasted some of my testing iteration, because I'm going to have to go back and retest some of those configurations and footprint. So one of the biggest things I could recommend actually is for any product, especially a client installable application, the closer you get to the time that you're going to Apple review, you need to be way more strict about which changes you will merge into your release candidate. And I'm talking like take it seriously, because that is exactly what will keep you from launching on time and will keep you launching odd milestones for a year. Yeah. I mean, it's collaborative. I don't do it unless, I'm pretty confident that anybody that's sane would agree with me, right? Like people who argue against it with me usually are a little too invested or just not informed.
Yeah, one more thing about that. We find, at least on my team, we find that if they involve us in the planning process for that feature, we have a much better idea of what the affected areas are, what the risk is, and how long it's going to take us to test. When they drop a feature on us, oh, by the way, we decided to do this, we're going to try and launch it, usually the answer is we don't have time to test it, it's not launching. That's kind of our blanket answer, because it's a much more interesting process when it's collaborative versus when it's a one-way flow of information. Yep.
All right, I think that was the last questions. Thank you for your attendance, and thank you for all the questions.
We'll keep you posted on future events, so stay tuned in the Meetup community. And thanks again to our amazing speakers. We really appreciate it. We hope you had a great night.